over the past couple of weeks, we have seen the beginnings of what Boris Johnson considers to be his main core strategy. But this isn't a strategy that suddenly has started and come into being. This has been pretty much his strategy ever since the beginning, ever since going back to when he was mayor of London. Boris loves to pick fights, and he loves especially to pick pointless fights, and loves to pick fights that aren't even really an issue. You know, he, as the saying goes, he loves to make a mountain out of a molehill. And that is essentially Boris Johnson's current strategy to a T, especially when it comes to dealing with the EU. But even on the EU's end, the patience with dealing with Boris Johnson, and especially Frost, who was specifically put in place to help Boris with this strategy. You know, it's perfect. It makes complete sense. I mean, we saw at the G7 where essentially all Boris did was get told on by like the other leaders of the G7, and then complained that he was getting told off. You know, it's been described before that him and Lord Frost are like the naughty boys on the school playground, picking fights and then running to teacher to report to report that essentially that they didn't start it. You know, but this is the strategy, and it seems to be because a lot of people are now looking at the Amersham and Chesham by-election and are really starting to examine, are like the traditional core of Tory voters so fed up already of Boris Johnson and his ridiculous strategies that they may very well vote Lib Dem? Because after all, one of the big things that the Conservatives had going for them, especially down south for quite a while, was that they didn't want Jeremy Corbyn in. So now that Jeremy Corbyn's gone and he's not in the Labour Party, and I've said very possible, the next general election could very well quickly come down, I think, to a hung parliament. I think that's a very, very good possibility, and I wouldn't be surprised to put money on it. We could see potentially Labour and the Lib Dems maybe join together to create a coalition government. But obviously that relies essentially on the Tory vote completely collapsing, not only in the south, but in the north as well. Because the Tories cannot win with the southern wall alone. They have to win seats in the north. But as we've said quite recently, the more Boris starts to appeal to the north, the more the southern seats and the southern MPs feel abandoned. And the more he starts to play to the southern MPs and their constituents, the more he abandons the northern seats. So he's walking a very tight tightrope. And this strategy that he's come up with of picking fights specifically to appeal to the northerners does not play very well down south. So before we jump into today's article, please do remember to hit that like, share and subscribe button. And of course, down below there are links to my Patreon page, as well as a one-off donation link called Buy Me a Coffee, where you can, well, buy me a coffee. And as always, thank you very much to all the people who do support the channel that way. And on with the article. So this comes from The Guardian. And the title is, Picking Fights Has Served Johnson's Tories Well, but it is a strategy that may very well backfire. Until last week's Chesham and Amersham by-election, politics seemed incredibly easy for Boris Johnson's Conservatives. However disastrously they governed, the political outcomes in opinion polls, elections, and the control of the national conversation were consistently very favourable. And Johnson has arguably been Britain's most dominant incompetent ever. In our often very sour old democracy, politics is supposed to be difficult, especially for parties in their second decade in office, when disillusionment normally usually sets in. But the government has seemingly defied this convention, as it has for so many others. One of the keys is its unlikely ascendancy has been its willingness to pick fights. Liberals, lefties, lawyers, Remainers, anti-racists, Scottish nationalists, the EU, Channel 4, the BBC, even the Oxford students who voted to take down a photo of the Queen. And no potential enemy has ever been too large or even too small, it seems, for the government to leave it in peace. You could say there has been a quite frankness about this appetite for confrontation. In some ways, politics is always about conflicts between interest groups and philosophies as well as parties. But before Johnson and Prime Ministers, with the likes as Tony Blair and David Cameron, often sought to play these conflicts down. We're all in this together, as Cameron would like to say, in order to appeal to as widely an audience as possible. Yet, since 2015, the Conservatives have found that they can win elections with a strong support only from a few large selections of the population, principally older white voters and inhabitants of rural and small town England. Out of this realisation, the Johnson's government strategy of the confrontation has emerged, overseen by his trusted advisor, Murina Miz, a former member of the very abrasive but surprisingly right-wing Revolutionary Communist Party, who is now head of the Downing Street Policy Unit. This strategy claims that the best way to mobilise these groups of sometimes anxious, resentful voters is to tell them that their country and values are being undermined by a subversive force. As a government source recently told the website Tortoise, Boris thinks that he and Marina are in the same place on this vast majority of the public, and that every time there is another row about the status of Churchill or white privilege, another Labour seat becomes winnable. If the Conservatives capture the West Yorkshire seat of Batley and Spen from Labour next week, it is widely expected then that the Tory culture warriors will feel further vindicated. Their aggression seems to very much bewilder that of what remains of the centrist Britain. From the Tory Remainers who lost their seats in 2019 election to Keir Starmer, with his ineffectual constructive opposition, our politics is strewn with reasonable people who haven't yet come to terms with this change in tone. The media hasn't been much happier either. The confrontational ministers attract audiences from Twitter to the Today programme. Meanwhile, the right-wing press has been picking fights with liberals and lefties for decades, and this seems to delight to see what the Conservatives so wholeheartedly are joining in. In their coordinated attack lines, the relationship between the party and these new newspapers feels as closer than it has ever been. This aggression also seems to suit the times. Ever since the financial crisis of 2008, much of our politics has been a search for scapegoats, for people to blame for the ending of the relative prosperity and stability of the 90s and 2000s. Attacking the liberal lefts is a good way of drawing attention away from the real causes of today's deep environmental and economic crisis, conservative free market capitalism, and the consumer appetites of the voters themselves. And yet, there is something a bit too neat and this self-stylized about this Tory strategy. There is no magic potions in politics. The effects of new tactics always wear off after a while. And the unexpected loss of the Tory citadel of Chesham and Amersham to the Lib Dems may be a sign that aggression is starting to repeal. Voters who prefer Sarah Green, a Remainer, who emphasised her record on helping individuals facing injustice after years of polarising, exhausting politics, it would not be a surprise if voters elsewhere also began to find less divisive figures appealing again. The relative consensual politics of the 90s and the noughties was itself partly a reaction against the red-tooth conservatism of the Thatcher era, and with its constant hunger for the enemy within. At the G7 in Cornwall this month, there was another sign that the Tory aggression may be reaching its useful limits. Johnson's plan to use the gathering as an advertisement for global Britain were partly ruined by his government's argument with the EU over the Northern Ireland. Like all rows between Britain and the EU, this may very well play with Tory voters. But to be seen in only those terms is very short-sighted and very parochial. Not all politics is national. Relations with other countries also matter. If Britain is seen as untrustworthy in trade negotiations, that will affect the economy and ultimately voter incomes as well. Blair sometimes made the mistake as a premier of trying to reduce politics to to the efficient administration. And Johnson is doing this differently, but equally lying if not larger, trying to reduce politics to the electoral. He also may discover that if the post-Brexit trade deals he promised don't happen, elections can be influenced by external factors. Culture wars and government flag waving may attract new voters, but they very well melt away if any clumsy nostalgia foreign policy makes it harder for them to pay the bills. By picking fights, the Conservatives also assume that their chosen enemies are also weak and will remain so. Yet, the balance of forces in society today is not static. Today's left-leaning millennials, also derided by the Tories, will become decisive voters in future elections, like generations of young people before them. Unless they drastically change their views, it's hard to see what conservatism can actually offer them. Finally, all the current outwardly directing Tory aggression feels like a promotion of a very way of delaying the battles likely to come within the Conservatism themselves, between its northern and southern voters, its free-spending ministers and fiscally cautious ones, its free marketers and its economic interventionists, its reactionaries and social liberals. In Chesham and Amersham, some of these tensions burst out into the open, and the Tory vote completely disintegrated. Divisive politics, when it's successful, is about drawing lines between your party and an electorally sufficient mass of supporters on your side and your enemies on the other. Johnson's government is doing well at the time, but if these lines start to be drawn within your own party, politics gets harder. When that happens, the Tories' acrimonious history since Thatcher suggests it will soon will. Johnson's days of easy dominance will feel like a very distant world. And we've said this before. The divisions in the Labour Party are going to become huge. At the moment, these are tiny cracks, but trust me, as it said there, the Chesham and Amersham by-election, these divisions in the Tory party will explode. And we've already talked before the two big ideas, global Britain, levelling up, the southern MPs versus the northern MPs, the free market fundamentalists versus those who favour economic interventionism by the government. Sooner or later, Johnson is going to have to actually deal with proper policies. And he is going to have to side with the one or the other. The pandemic will not last forever. And currently, the Tory party is somewhat united over the fact of trying to get out of COVID. But when it comes to the matter of how should Britain recover from this pandemic, that is when we will start to see these chasms widen even more. And we've already seen it with the educational catch-up budget, which pretty much relates to giving every child in the UK in school about £100 extra to help them catch up. And frankly, as we've said before, it is a drop in a bucket of what the children in the UK need. You've only got to look at other countries where they've done equivalent catch-up funds. And it relates to over like £2,500 per child. The difference is staggering. But those other countries recognise how important that is. And like I say, we're already looking at the potential loss of over 350 billion in a loss of earnings and a loss of over 100 million to the tax collector in general. So as you can see, these divisions in the Tory party, while it may seem united on the face of it, really behind the wallpaper is just massive cracks waiting to swallow up Johnson whole. So as always, thank you very much for watching, and please do remember to hit that like, share and subscribe button. And of course, down below there are links to my Patreon page, as well as a one-off donation link called Buy Me a Coffee, where you can buy me a coffee. And as always, thank you very much to all the people who do support me that way. And as always, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you all next time.